Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Just by way of brief introduction, I'm Mark Huxley, and I'm leading today's Knowledge Miles 695th Lord Mayor's lecture, which the topic today, Leadership in Sustainable Finance, Charting a Course Through Purpose, Profit and Politics. So I'll give you a quick rundown how the session's going to run. So I will properly introduce our speaker, Simon Thompson. Simon, welcome in a moment. He will then speak for about 20 minutes, which should give us some good time for questions and answers at the end, which I'll be monitoring, and we'll get through as many of those as we can. Please don't use the chat box on the top right hand corner. There's one that's got a question mark on it, which is the question box. So please look at and put your questions in there, because we won't be looking at the chat part of it. So if you can make sure to do that, that'll be good. We're going to record the session and it will go up reasonably quickly afterwards, and also any of the unasked questions, or if you need further clarification or Simon wants to give, all of the questions will go across to Simon so he can follow up in his own way. So as I said before, welcome Simon, thank you for joining us. Just to not spare any of your blushes, sir, Simon's the Chief Executive of the Chartered Banker Institute. Under his leadership, the Institute has grown to become the largest professional body of bankers with 36,000 members in students in more than 100 countries. In 2022, the Institute launched the Principles for Responsible Banking Academy in partnership with UNEP FI to support the alignment of bank strategies, operations, activities, and the objections with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. Simon's also a published author, Green and Sustainable Finance Principles and Practice, which was published by Kogan Page. And he chairs the UK Sustainable Finance Education Charter on behalf of the Department for Net Zero and Energy Security, and is a board member of the UK Financial Services Commission, FSSC, and also former Vice President of European Bank Training Network. And if that's not enough, Simon is also a fellow of the Chartered Banking Institute and a member of the Chartered Institute. So Simon, I'm going to go quiet. I'm going to pass over to you. So without further ado, the floor is yours, sir.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much, Mark, and good morning, everybody. Let me just share my slides. There we go. And well, thank you to the Lord Mayor as well, and to Gresham College for their kind invitation to contribute to this wonderful series of Knowledge Miles lectures. I've been enjoying many of them, and I've loved hearing about the UK and London's leading role in business, in finance, the arts, science, and more. And in the area I'm going to speak about this morning, sustainable finance, it's another area where the UK and London genuinely do lead the world, with the UK a leading decarboniser and the City of London ranked #1 in successive editions of the Global Green Finance Index. But we've work to do if we want to keep it that way, which is one of the things I'll be touching on later. I don't think it should be any surprise to us that climate change and related topics are of great current interest. Perhaps that's why we've already had several Knowledge Mile lectures on related topics. I particularly enjoyed Sir Jonathan Porritt's lecture in January. And I think the next one on Wednesday is on the energy transition and the role of fans. That's the revolving kind of fans rather than the applauding kind, which sounds intriguing. Because many, including myself, sort of view climate change and related environmental and societal issues as our greatest collective global challenge, hence why they're very much the subject of public and political discourse globally, not just here in the UK. But why are climate change and sustainability topics that banks and bankers, business and finance professionals more broadly should and increasingly do care about, and why has there been in some parts of the US, the UK and Europe at least, something of a backlash against business and financial institutions addressing climate change and sustainability? And what can we do to move past this? So that's what I hope to cover today over the next 20 minutes or so. Now, I joined the Chartered Banker Institute 15, maybe nearly 16 years ago now, just before queues began forming outside Northern Rock. I should say, I don't think the events were connected, but that heralded in the UK the global financial crisis, following which I think many policymakers and regulators, many in the finance sector itself, felt we needed to fundamentally reconsider our role in society and align our activities with more socially purposeful, longer term aims and objectives that could deliver greater shared economic and social value. Finance, in short, ought to become more sustainable, which in the broad context I and many others use it generally refers to meeting the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Now, those needs may be wide, or are wide and varied, and they differ around the world, but many approaches to sustainability focus on three key aspects, often thought of as a three-legged stool or similar: the economy, the environment, and society. And of course, when one of the three legs isn't supported, the whole thing falls over. Since 2015, with the Paris Agreement, we've tended to focus on addressing the environmental challenge, the global challenge of climate change, and more recently, environmental issues beyond but interlinked with climate change have come to the fore, what we often refer to as the Triple Planetary Crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, the latter addressed through the Global Biodiversity Framework agreed in Montreal in 2022. Now, the Paris Agreement on climate change has three objectives set out in Article 2. The first, I hope everybody will know, it's to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and as close to 1.5 degrees as possible. And that's the big headline. The most recent assessment of warming from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that's the strong global scientific consensus, reported a year ago. We've got a very small window, very small window now to keep global temperatures below those levels. And since that report, we saw last year, 2023, the hottest year on record ocean temperatures, record concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, record at least in terms of human history. So this looks even less achievable without urgent, sustained and coordinated global climate action, going beyond faster with much greater urgency the transition away from fossil fuels agreed at COP28 in the UAE in December. Now, the second Paris Agreement objective is also fairly widely known, at least I feel it is, to promote climate resilient development, to help countries, communities and businesses adapt, become more resilient to a world that, even if we were somehow to hit net zero tomorrow, would still be impacted by warming for decades to come because of the emissions we've already put into the atmosphere. A changing world that will affect us all is already affecting many of us in terms of water and food security, health and economic prospects beyond the immediate impacts of warmer surface temperatures. But the third of the three Paris Agreement objectives is less well known, yet is critical to achieving the first two. Article 2.1c requires countries to make flows of finance consistent with lowering greenhouse gas emissions and promoting climate resilient development. And I think it's very telling that the key global climate change agreement and now the global biodiversity framework as well single out the critical role of finance. And as countries increasingly adapt, albeit not with the ambition and urgency required, net zero climate targets and objectives to address and reverse biodiversity loss, then finance, banking, investment, insurance, all the supporting professions around finance, accounting, law and so on, will be required to play a leading role in the transition of energy, transport, agriculture, buildings, manufacturing. In fact, we need to think of this as a whole economy transition that requires decarbonising almost every economic activity, almost every economic entity everywhere in the world to sustainable low or zero carbon nature positive models. That's what transition really means. It's a new industrial revolution compressed into hopefully 20 or 30 rather than 200 years, which presents many challenges for the high carbon sectors and firms themselves and the countries and communities highly dependent on these, but it also unlocks very significant commercial opportunities for business and finance. The transition of all organizations, large and small, everywhere in the world, requires finance, a lot of finance. The plausible estimates from the likes of the World Bank and the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate put the investment required at between perhaps $5 to $7 trillion per year for the next 20 years. Now, someone described that to me as similar to the World War II Marshall Reconstruction Program plus the Apollo space program combined, which I think is a nice way to frame it. McKinsey in 2020 estimated the total investment to achieve net zero in the EU by 2050 at 28 trillion euros. In total, here in the UK, the Committee on Climate Change estimate the investment required for UK net zero by the same date at some £50 billion per year. So while there are powerful ethical and environmental arguments for tackling the triple planetary crisis, and I would personally like business and finance professionals to be led by these, there are also very strong and compelling commercial reasons for banks and bankers, finance and business people to take sustainability into account in investment and business strategy and decision making, and when we allocate capital. Both on the risk side, addressing the physical and transition risks of climate change and nature loss to financial institutions directly, and via our exposure to sectors and clients vulnerable to these, and on the opportunity side, financing the pioneers in clean technology and infrastructure, in renewable energy, sustainable supply chains, circular economy, financing firms at the forefront of emerging consumer markets, and financing all of those sectors and firms that need to transition. That's the size of the $5 to $7 trillion per year investment opportunity to be captured. And this isn't something governments can pay for. So 80% of the finance required will need to come from private finance, in particular bank lending and institutional investment. The good news is we have the financial firepower we need, much of it held in savings balances in regions like the US, emerging regions such as Southeast Asia and the Gulf. However, globally, there's still a very long way to go. As at present, only some sort of 5% of finance can I think be genuinely described as being green and sustainable. Global financial portfolios are estimated to align with more than 3 degrees of warming, perhaps closer to 4 degrees. And within that, sustainable finance is highly concentrated. So a body called the Climate Policy Initiative, which tracks global climate finance flows, reported a near doubling of climate finance globally between 2021 and 2022. We don't have the 2023 figures yet, but nearly 90% of that increase came from clean energy investment in the US, Europe, China, Brazil, Japan, and India, meaning many countries and many sectors were not receiving the funding required. In particular, a particular concern is the financing of adaptation, climate resilience. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, the adaptation finance gap last year stood at some 90% of the finance required. So financing mitigation and adaptation, financing this transition requires the rapid and sustained decarbonisation of lending and investment portfolios globally, and a substantial redeployment of global capital, therefore. In fact, what we're really talking about here is a fundamental realignment of finance, so that in UN Special Envoy and former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney's words to COP26 in Glasgow, we need to get to the point where every professional financial decision takes climate change into account. A realignment that in the UK, Europe, and to an extent the US and other territories such as Singapore, Malaysia, India, and so on we started to make progress. And we've seen with the many sustainable finance commitments announced by banks and financial institutions, especially in and around each COP summit for the past few years, $1 trillion here by 2030, $1 trillion there by 2035. It does all soon start to add up. And the growth in membership and impact of some of the global financial alliances, such as GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, its constituent Net Zero Alliances, and others such as the Principles for Responsible Investment, the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Banking, PRB, which now has more than 350 member banks accounting for more than half of global banking assets under management. Yet, over the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen some pushback from some politicians and some sections of the commentariat in some countries. I think it's important to recognise this is only in some countries, indeed maybe only in some parts of some countries. In China, in India, in the Gulf, in many parts of Southeast Asia, if anything, there's been an acceleration of policy action in climate finance. But in the UK, the US, and Europe, there's undoubtedly been something of a backlash against ESG, against net zero, against the short-term costs that seek to paint addressing environmental and social issues as anti-capitalist, as bad for business and society, as woke. The criticisms at a political level, often based on short-term political calculations and engaging core voters rather than anything else. For example, the recent challenges to the SEC's proposed climate risk rules in the US, or the approvals for the new Rosebank oil and gas fields, or delay to electric vehicle introduction in the UK. Maybe taken separately, perhaps each individual policy decision or delay doesn't really matter in the overall scheme of things. But as a whole, though, they do threaten to, at best, delay, possibly derail the urgent and sustained climate action required, and create an environment that's not conducive to the policy stability required to accelerate and maintain decarbonisation, transition and investment, which needs long-term stability and patient capital. And from a UK perspective, this does threaten the UK and London's position as the leading global sustainable finance hub. We're also now starting to see some senior figures from banking and finance adopt a more thoughtful and nuanced approach too, calling on politicians and policymakers to provide those stable policy incentives in the policy environment, rather than leaving this to the banking and finance sector to be the phrase is often used, the climate police, determining where investment should and shouldn't go. And I think that's fair. I mean, market forces will not, while the carbon externality is fundamentally mispriced, ensure the appropriate allocation of capital by itself. I don't think we'd wish our banks and financial institutions only to work with those sectors and firms that are clean and green, or at the very least have robust and credible transition plans, which would just be a small minority of the economy overall. So we do need clearer and consistent policy direction to base our long-term financial decisions on. Now, you'd think, or you might even hope, that the strong global scientific consensus on climate change and biodiversity loss, combined with the evidence before our eyes of the increase in severity and frequency of extreme weather events, glaciers and ice sheets shrinking, coral reefs bleaching and so on, will concentrate minds and drive action. Progress has been made, of course. Climate action over the past 20 years has reduced the likelihood of a 4-degree warmer world, puts us on a current trajectory for perhaps 2.6 to 2.8 degrees. Global action on CFCs, the Montreal Protocol, means the ozone layer looks like it should recover by mid-century, which incidentally will reduce global warming by about 0.5 degree by the end of the century. So intergovernmental processes are working, just nowhere near as quickly as needed, without the political drive, determination and consistency required. Now, there are some who don't believe the climate science. Science, of course, is not a belief system. It's a systematic method for understanding the natural world based on evidence, experimentation and peer review to which some of the purveyors of alternative facts are often extremely reluctant to subject their version of reality to. And then there are the political populists who'll say whatever they think needs to be said to get elected or re-elected, whether in Uxbridge or the USA. We're going to struggle, I think, to change their minds, but it's not that small yet sometimes influential minority. It's not them I think we need ultimately to reach. We need to be engaged. We need to be much better at engaging the great majority of the population who understand we can't carry on as we are, but for whom the challenges seem too big, too distant, too costly, too scary to give them agency to feel they can do anything about them. It's the tragedy of the commons and the tragedy of the horizon, compounded by the tragedy of all the jargon we in the business and finance world, especially in the sustainable finance community, use to position ourselves as the experts. ISSB versus EFRS, TCFD and TNFD, and not least those three really terrifying letters E, S and G. And I think the reality is that those of us in business and finance who understand the compelling ethical, environmental and commercial cases for climate action and finance are not engaging effectively with the majority at the moment. We spend too long in our own community, our own carbon bubble, if you like, too often making the wider world feel guilty about what they've done, are doing or aren't doing enough of. Please fly less, drive less, or pay more to continue to drive your car in a low emission zone. Eat less meat, reduce waste, recycle more. We spend too long maybe focusing on the negative, what we need to stop, what we need to avoid, rather than stressing the positive. We need to be educating and informing our customers, our colleagues and communities about the jobs, the growth, the energy security, the peace, the shared prosperity that comes from a successful, socially just transition. And at an individual level, educating and informing about how we can lower household bills, especially energy costs, and improve quality of life. We're fortunate in business and finance to possess that significant influence, not only via our access to large parts of society as our customers and our colleagues, but also through the access we have to decision makers and our ability to shape policy agendas. And a strong ethical case can be made for sustainable business and finance, but in shaping politics and policy, a sound commercial case based on jobs, on growth, on addressing emerging and growing geopolitical and economic risks, on ensuring national energy and physical security will resonate more strongly. And so we need to embed climate action and sustainability more broadly within broader national strategies. So the US Inflation Reduction Act is a brilliant example of this, tackling climate change and accelerating climate finance, but stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship, driving growth and creating jobs overall. Tempting as it is, though, we can't just blame politicians and the policy environment and dissolve all responsibility for tackling the climate crisis and realigning finance to our lords and masters. Ultimately, it's for those of us who work in the sector who are responsible for our sector, for our firms, for the priorities, strategies, decisions, for the cultures, the values and norms we develop and sustain within our organisations. We're responsible for ensuring the economic, environmental and social sustainability of our institutions and the financial system overall, and for ensuring that banking and finance, and to a large extent, I think markets and capitalism overall, create genuine shared prosperity for current and future generations. So how do we embed the purpose and principles of sustainability in our corporate cultures and the culture of banking and finance overall, so they're always and everywhere part of decision making, part of the way we do business? To come back to Mark Carney's words, to ensure every professional financial decision takes account of climate change, although I think we should reframe this in terms of wider environmental and social sustainability, not just climate change. Well, I mean, generally the thought to be three drivers of culture and hence decision making: governance and leadership, rewards and incentives, and capability and competence. I mean, going through this is for a different lecture rather than this one. But I think there's two additional factors particularly relevant in terms of aligning decision making, culture and purpose with sustainability that we need to add to this. The first is having easy and timely access to the relevant data we need to support decision making. What gets measured gets managed, and then in turn, what gets rewarded gets done. So we can link this to the rewards and incentives part as well. That credible, consistent, comparable and accessible data we need on firms' environmental and social sustainability impacts, it gets better every day. It's still not as widely available as it needs to be. And I think there's a great opportunity here to bring together the world of technology and AI and the world of sustainability, with the UK and London in the forefront as a global centre for both. And then there's also the need for much wider stakeholder engagement, transparency and accountability. We need to become much more comfortable with welcoming input from and dialogue with those impacted by our business and financial decisions, whose voices too often aren't heard in the boardroom. And be transparent, be honest and be accountable when mistakes are made, as they will be when we're working with this. It's very complicated. But let's learn from mistakes so that crucially we don't try and avoid innovation and taking risks, because it's only through innovation and risk taking we'll successfully achieve the transition. We need a really entrepreneurial mindset to get this right, I think. And if embedding sustainability requires deep cultural change at an organisational level, then that implies that ultimately every banking and finance professional needs to embed the principles and practice of green and sustainable finance within their daily practice and activities. It doesn't mean we all need to become climate scientists and sustainability experts. That's not the goal here. What we need are banks and bankers, investors, insurers, accountants and lawyers who are great at their professional day job, but apply that with a lens of sustainability too. And to help with this, I've developed the 9 integrity principles to help individuals. Now, finance professionals, let's just stress, should always act with integrity and professionalism. This isn't something that's just the case for sustainable finance. Ours is a profession built on trust and trustworthiness. And when we lose the trust of the public we serve, this has serious consequences for the financial services sector and society, as we've seen on too many occasions. I think integrity, though, is especially important in the context of green and sustainable finance, especially when we're trying to avoid greenwashing. So we should require all banking and finance professionals to approach this with integrity. Meaning, we should integrate sustainability into all of our professional practice, aligning our business and financial practices with sustainability. So doing our day job really well, but with a lens of sustainability added to it. And we should nurture and nourish the culture of our organisations, or the bit of the organisation we sit in, and try and establish some of the strong professional norms we need aligned with sustainability. And ultimately, sustainability, it can't become just part of our strategy. It needs to become deeply embedded in the purpose and culture of organisations and teams, what's known as a deep green strategy. T, we need to target transparency, measuring progress and reporting the positive and negative environmental and social impacts of our financial and business decisions. E, we should engage with established principles, standards, frameworks and guidance wherever possible. There's a lot out there, from the green bond, green loan principles, the sustainability linked loan and bond principles, the PRB, the PRI frameworks and so on, and encourage others to engage with those too. G, we should give high quality and robust professional advice and guidance to our customers, clients and colleagues that help them plan and finance their transitions, take account of climate risk, understand the opportunities. R, we need to take responsibility, holding our firm and ourselves as individuals accountable for the impacts of our strategies, activities, operations and decisions, recognizing we'll get it wrong from time to time, but that's okay, as long as we can be honest about and learn from our mistakes. I, we need to inspire an inclusive approach, appreciating that a successful whole economy transition requires working with customers, clients, colleagues, communities, and a wide range of external stakeholders. We need to lead and work beyond the boundaries of our organisation and bring in the academic, the scientific, the NGO communities, amongst others, who may have some of the insight and approaches we're looking for. T, we need to think long term. As I mentioned a few moments ago, a narrow short-term focus on financial returns isn't compatible with sustainability. A longer-term view engenders the creation of shared sustainable prosperity for all. So we need to set strategies, take decisions, ensure we're rewarding, remunerating, incentivizing with the longer term in mind. And finally, the letter Y, because ultimately it's not down to somebody else, it's down to you, the finance professional, the business person, the lawyer, the accountant, the concerned individual, to make a difference. And strategies you develop, decisions you take, the culture you lead and embed in your organization, and then the culture we collectively lead across finance. That's what will determine whether finance will generally create sustainable prosperity for current and future generations and take environmental and social factors into account alongside economic and financial considerations. And we can also, therefore, individually and collectively, ensure that the UK and London remain the global centres for and continue to be the home of sustainable finance. Look forward to hearing your comments and reactions. Thank you.
Simon, thank you. Very, very interesting, and lots of questions coming in. So we'll try and get through as many of them as we can to start with. They've come in some quite strong threads. So many of them are that balancing act you talked about, the kind of long-term goals versus short-term needs for corporations, shareholders and the like, which is kind of holding back the pace of change. So just to call out a couple of question comments, Clive Bullen says, aren't we going far too slow? What should happen at the government level and by the LSE to make a big difference? There was another...
yes, we are going far.
Yep.
We are going far too slow. Yes.
Yep. So there was another from David Holmes saying, do democracies find it harder to address the long-term green finance challenge, the changes needed due to short-term election cycles we have at government? How do we address this? So give me a couple of wrap-ups around those kind of themes and topics.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, yes, we are going too slowly. That's what the science tells us. You know, the key phrase from the IPCC is the need for, if I get this right, so urgent or dramatic, rapid and sustained climate action, you know, from all the actors involved, whether that's sort of governments, finance, businesses, civil society organisations, and so on. You know, we kind of pat ourselves on the back at the recent kind of COP summit because we've agreed some words to transition away from fossil fuels, and yet it is only words. You know, we're not transitioning away anywhere near as quickly as we need to. I mean, what needs to be done for me? And I don't underestimate the challenges of this as a policy intervention. The key is consistent and credible carbon pricing at economically realistic levels, or at least a clear path to get there. So the IMF, International Monetary Fund, I think estimates $75 per tonne it would be required to get to net zero globally by mid-century. And we have seen the EU carbon price get close to 100 euros a year ago before falling back to below 50. I think it was sort of 68, 70 last week, something like that. But you know, the world's largest emitter, China, has introduced an ETS, a carbon pricing scheme, but you know, that's levels there are well below sort of $10 per ton. And I think kind of globally, carbon prices vary between, I think the lowest is somewhere, it's a few cents anyway, up to kind of more than $155 per ton in some of the Scandinavian countries. The World Bank has a global carbon price dashboard, which is great for this. But why does carbon pricing matter? Well, because at the moment we misallocate capital on a very large scale because we fundamentally misprice the carbon externality, the environmental and social costs of emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So lending to and investing in the carbon intensive sectors is more attractive than it should be. So that for me would accelerate change. How we get there is going to be very, very challenging for some of the reasons around democratic politics, as the one of the questions has pointed out. Although again, it's an area we're seeing progress in. The EU is introducing the carbon border adjustment mechanism and things. We move there more slowly than we would like. So I'm kind of cautiously optimistic we're moving in the right direction, just nowhere near fast enough.
Yeah, and there was a question which kind of picked out the Labour Party comment about withdrawing the £28 billion of green investment coming out, which maybe stands as an exemplar of that as well. Interesting to talk about kind of capital management. There's a lot of questions around kind of alignment across sectors, industries, and internationally. So there's a question from Tom Squarek. Green infrastructure finance is available and in capital, but neither the banks nor long-term investors struggle to take the construction, regulatory and performance risk for many renewable projects, i.e. small modular reactors. What can be done to align capital market, insurance risk takers and regulators during the construction stage of major infrastructure projects? And there was a very early question that came in calling out some work that you've been doing through your association in Qatar and some of the international partnerships. And the question was, how do we get involved as the international partners that want to be involved as individuals?
Well, I guess on the on the latter, I've been spending quite a bit of time out in Qatar and the UAE and surrounding countries, particularly over the last sort of 12, 18 months in the run up to COP there. There's a sort of real desire in that part of the world. It often surprises people, given they are major oil and gas producers, but they also understand that there is a glide path to a point at which we stop extracting sort of fossil fuels. They see themselves as the lowest cost producers, so therefore they'll be the last people standing, the last people extracting fossil fuels from the ground. When they get to that point, they want to make sure they've invested the revenue sort of sensibly in a more sustainable future, both in terms of ensuring their own climate resilience, but also producing or making sure they continue to produce economic returns to support local populations. So that's why you're seeing some very, very big investments and a lot more interest in both mitigation and adaptation within the Gulf region and investing around the world too. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for folks sort of out there, and a lot of opportunity for the UK. As I know, many financial institutions and engineering firms and consultancies and sort of other specialist areas are already working out there in great numbers. On the sort of the infrastructure piece, that's really interesting. So this comes to the heart of this need for different types of capital, because often we're talking about, I think the example you gave was of sort of modular reactors. There's another interesting debate there that many will have about the extent to which can nuclear power be considered as sustainable? Is it a transition fuel? Should we be avoiding it at all? And there's different sides of that. But whether it's the modular reactors, whether it's district heat networks, which I think are an important area for the UK, or other sort of aspects of decarbonisation or climate resilient infrastructure, these are big ticket items. We need to bring in the long-term institutional investors, the pension funds and so on. We'd also need people to take other aspects of that, unlock some of the or take some of the shorter term sort of retrofitting areas that might be needed, for instance. So the challenge is, it's not, I think we often try and see this through, is there a single financial institution that sort of does this? Well, there isn't. We need the people like in Scotland, we have the Scottish National Investment Bank, the UK Infrastructure Bank, the governments and things to bring folks together and put together what's known as sort of blended finance solutions, where each investor with a different risk and reward appetite is taking a different part of that, but we're funding the whole thing overall. And I don't underestimate the challenges of that. It's not easy. It's very costly. It's very difficult to bring people together. But it can be done. There's some great examples now, particularly if you look in Scotland at some of the district heat network proposals that are coming forward, which have a sort of 40, 50-year payback or something. But it can be invested in. It can be financed.
Okay. There's a very, very short question. How do we incentivize? So this is good actors, bad actors. So how are we going to properly recognize, reward, and encourage the good actors to carry on doing what they're doing? And there's lots of questions about how do I get involved? What do I do? So there's an incentivize part of it, but there is also on the other side of it an equal amount of questions and comments in the box there about how do we de-incentivize the bad actors. And I'll just pick one out from Ian Stewart, who says the top 20 global climate polluters dominated by China, India, US, EU were responsible for 83% of emissions in 2022. Why are major polluters not targeted more successfully? So how do we encourage the good actors, and what are we going to do to really kind of move on the bad actors? And I'll put if you don't mind, a little supplement, because I think it will be a natural pull into that, is some may tell from the background. I'm in the Lloyd's Insurance building, which has been my background, and it's suffered. It's enough slings and arrows being thrown at the building about it, and doesn't really seem to have actually engaged with the activist groups enough to actually create a dialogue. So it feels a very binary: incentivize, de-incentivize. How do we get more of a better diplomatic dialogue and diplomacy in play?
Yeah, well, to look at the various aspects of that, in terms of the sort of incentives and the disincentives, I'll go back to ultimately it has to come down. We have to be pricing the externality correctly. I feel that the single biggest factor that determines investment in sector A versus sector B. It's the financial institutions' capital allocation decisions, and at the moment, though, we're simply misallocating because of the lack of a globally consistent carbon price. I mean, some financial institutions do use internal carbon pricing, and that helps, but of course, we need a level playing field, across, if not the whole world, at least the developed kind of capital markets, and that will help. And that needs to be driven by policy and regulation. So it does need some difficult political decisions to be made. I don't underestimate how challenging that will be. At a sort of more basic level, one of the things I do worry about is people might have heard of the phrase that's kind of crept into discourse over the past 6 months or a year or so of green hushing. This is where good practice, genuinely good practice, isn't being sort of highlighted and being praised because of the risk of a backlash. Very often, the classic example is a financial institution has made a positive difference in one area, but another part of the financial institution is still funding deforestation in the Amazon or still funding sort of fossil fuels. And so in trying to highlight what they're doing well, simply, we know the way the media works. No one likes good news. It's always better to have bad news. Therefore, everyone gets criticised, and people feel, well, you know what, I'm not going to put my head above the parapet. That's really dangerous, because actually we do need to be highlighting and celebrating the examples of genuine good practice, whether that's in banking and finance or business more generally. When we do that, we have to be honest. So we should be on the front foot and saying we're doing this, but we accept we're also doing these things we shouldn't be doing, and here's our plan to move away from that. But that's really, the peer networks that are growing up around finance are very, very important and do help move progress forward. Then the point about the NGOs, I think, is really well made, and one of the maybe unintended benefits, perhaps that's the right phrase, of the drive for sustainability has been the extent to which financial institutions, and particularly in the UK and Europe, I've seen this. I mean, I'm just less familiar in other parts of the world. The extent to which we are engaging with a wide range of NGOs in the climate and environmental space. So bodies like Greenpeace, the WWF, Worldwide Fund for Nature, CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, and so on. In fact, people might be quite surprised that just how intensively some of these bodies do engage with financial institutions. I mean, I think last year the WWF was recruiting heads of finance and things like that, because the NGOs understand the key role of finance in a successful transition, and I think the financial institutions understand that the NGOs can often bring in, and other civil society organisations can bring in a lot of expertise, as does academia and the scientific community, the engineering community. Great example, if you want to understand green hydrogen, most bankers don't understand green hydrogen. There'll be some wonderful engineers, NGOs, academics who do. So let's bring them into our organisation. I think that's really positive for the culture of finance in general. One of the things that led to the global financial crisis was the fact we became very, very insular of always speaking to ourselves. So while there's clearly some NGOs and civil society institutions that are of the more sort of extreme nature, and it's quite hard to have maybe a dialogue. I think there's many out there that aren't and are very thoughtful about the role that finance can and should play. And I think also we should be honest and thoughtful enough to accept that the NGOs and civil society will want to push us further and faster than perhaps we're prepared to go at the moment. But that's okay. We need groups to keep pushing us to do more, to do faster, to move with greater urgency, because that's ultimately what the science tells us.
Okay, one last question, and probably got a minute and a half, couple of minutes to answer it. And I'm going to take two questions into this. One is 9 principles, fantastic. How do we implement it? What are you practically doing to get this through the door? And there's a really good question about young adults from Jonathan Brill. Does upskilling young adults in financial literacy have a role to play within embedding financial sustainability? Goes back to your culture point, I think you were making very much at the start.
Yeah. Well, so I think financial literacy is, for me, this is an essential part of the S in ESG. And actually, if you look at sort of many of the banks and financial institutions in Africa and how they're addressing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we didn't have the chance to talk about those sort of earlier, but many of them are prioritizing sort of financial literacy as a really kind of key area for building a stronger society. Some would even prioritize it above climate change and things like that. But I think, but financial literacy also, I would suggest, in the UK context, then this needs to include aspects of sustainable finance. Again, we've got to be careful. Financial literacy shouldn't be giving people financial advice and saying, you should be investing here or there. But, look at the wonderful work that some of the campaigns such as Make Money Matter and things do with encouraging us to look at where our pensions are invested. So, let's teach people about pensions, and let's also teach people about where that money is being invested. If we're teaching people about mortgages, then let's at the basic level teach people about climate risk and flood risk and the cost of insurance depending on where you're buying houses, and all these sorts of things that are going to become ever more important. And then in terms of embedding the 9 principles, well, those are principles for individuals, so it's down to all of us to say this is how we want to address our personal and professional lives. So it's not down to anybody else to do this. It's down to all of us as individuals and collectively.
Okay, very, very quickly, are you pushing, promoting, advertising and amplifying those 9 principles then, so it gets more into our subconscious?
Well, yes. Yes, I mean, both through the book, through the Chartered Banker Institute, through the Principles for Responsible Banking Academy, and through all the things we do. Because yes, I would like to see every finance professional sort of everywhere in the world, adopt. If not, I mean, of course, it'd be great if everyone bought my book, but that's a bit of a pipe dream. But everybody, this comes back to Mark Carney's point around we need to get to the point where every professional financial decision takes account of climate change. That implies that every finance professional needs to develop an understanding of the principles and practice of sustainable finance to be able to do that. Again, we don't all need to be deep experts in this stuff. We all need to know the basics, and we all need to apply that in the context of our professional practice.
Lovely. Simon, time is against us, so thank you. just to bring it to a close, I think it will come up on screen in a minute about some of the upcoming lectures, so we can trail those, and I'll leave you to read those if they come up. I'm not seeing them yet, but really, oh, there we go, just right. So I won't say anything about those. I should leave you to have a quick glance at those, but just some thank yous. So thank you to the audience for joining us. You had a good number this morning, and a good number have stayed on at the end, so either they are asleep or they're interested. I think we're seeing they've not dialed off, which is good. So thank you for doing that. Thank you to the Lord Mayor for putting these lectures on once again. Yet another fascinating lecture, so another shout out for the upcoming 3 and the rest of the year. Obviously, a huge special thank you to you, Simon, not just for the time you gave up this morning, but also the clear effort that you put in to put this lecture together. Hugely insightful, hugely thoughtful, and hugely welcomed by the vast amount of clappy hands that are coming through the screen in the chat. So thank you for that. And that's it. So yeah. No, that's it. So that's it. So just wish everybody a happy week, and I think we're going to be cut off any second now by our proper host. So, Simon, thank you again.
Thank you, Mark. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great week.
Thanks, everyone.